Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. As always, I cannot wait to introduce our guest to you. But before I do, I'd like to thank a few people that we always thank. We'd like to thank brassandwinds.com. The Mighty Quinn Brass and Winds is where we go at the Willow School when we're looking for woodwind or brass instruments for our students. Check them out at brassandwinds.com. We think you'll be happy with them as well. You're watching Truer MU, the truth about music. Welcome to my musical mind. We try to go a little deeper than the usual questions about music and music-related things, and that includes writing. And in that vein, I would like to introduce our guest to you. But first, as always, there is a story. Kodak Harrison, famous Atlanta poet and musician, posted something on Facebook about a woman named Connie Converse, and I was curious, and I looked her up, and I listened to her, and I thought, well, she's interesting. Yeah, kind of neat. I wasn't compelled to do much more listening, but then there was another album I found, and this one was full of her art songs. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Most singer-songwriters don't write art songs. Well, I went ahead and listened to them, and I was transfixed. I thought, wow, this is really, really interesting. Now, these art songs were produced by a man named Howard Fishman, and that made me say, well, who's Howard Fishman? So I start looking at Howard Fishman, and I follow the path, and it takes me down a rabbit hole to a book about Connie Converse, and that's the thing we're going to start talking about today. So let me introduce our guest to you. Howard Fishman is an author, musician, composer, theater maker, and culture writer based in Brooklyn, New York. He is a frequent contributor to The New Yorker, and his writing has also been published by The New York Times, The Washington Post, Rolling Stone, The Telegraph, and Vanity Fair, among many others. His new book, To Anyone Who Ever Asks, The Life, Music, and Mystery of Connie Converse, is now available from Dutton Penguin Random House. Howard Fishman, welcome to our show.
Thanks so much for having me, Adam. Thanks for that nice introduction.
Oh, it's a delight to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's start, since Connie Converse has been your passion for quite some time. Who is she?
Who is Connie Converse? One of the most fascinating figures you will ever run across. Connie Converse was born in 1924 in Laconia, New Hampshire, grew up in Concord, New Hampshire. She how do I sum her up very quickly? She is mostly known right now for the work that she did as a musician composer, both of songs from maybe the popular music vein or just outside, but also the art song catalog that you just mentioned, Adam. But she was also a ferocious political thinker and writer and editor and activist, an illustrator, a painter, a poet, novelist, statistician, uh, person interested in conflict resolution and game theory. Somebody who I think never had a dull moment in her life, and who also, for to the unfortunately, lived most of her life basically invisible. In spite of doing all these things and doing them magnificently, she was unable, or people were unable to see her during her time. And it's only been in the 50 years or so since her disappearance in 1974 that people today are starting to pay attention to her.
So this is the definition of a polymath we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it does strike me as odd that she was, I mean, and we have evidence of how good she was in her writing, her songwriting, all of these things. It's not as if it wasn't available or seen by people. People heard her songs and they were compelled by them and remember them 50 years later.
Yes. But those people were, as she said, as she once quipped, among the dozens of fans I have all over the world. So it's not as though she had a great listenership during her time.
Yeah, what accounts for that, do you suppose? I mean, her performance style is quite compelling. You know, she's and of course her songs are very, very good. What do you how can you account for the small number of listeners?
I think the primary obstacles for her is that she was a woman that was working within a very male-dominated music industry at the time, that wanted its women to adhere to certain kinds of roles. Um, I always say they either virgin or vixen, and Connie Converse was not interested in being either of those things. So she was headstrong. She didn't want to conform, and the music that she was making had no context at that time. It's some of the music that she made is what today might be called singer-songwriter music. Um, but in that time, in the early 50s, there was no such thing in terms of the way that we think of that term today. It was just a good 10 or 12 years before Bob Dylan came along. So the people that were in charge of making decisions about who gets recorded and who gets promoted in those days didn't see any way to promote her with any viability, any way to make money on what she was doing, because there was no, as I say, there's no context for it.
Yeah, so kind of like not exactly the same, but kind of like a Charles Ives type. So just somebody who was just thinking ahead of their time and just there was no place for them when they were alive.
That's right.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, let's break her down a little bit. You you you've been studying Connie Converse at 13 years or more. You started with an article or two about her, then you produced a play about her, if I'm correct, and then you spent years on a book. What is it you find most compelling, for instance, about her songwriting?
Well, I I always say that when I first encountered Connie Converse, I was at a particularly low moment in my life and in my career. I was feeling disconnected and that I didn't belong. And I think that those themes are in her music and in her lyrics. And there is a yearning and a kind of searching feeling in a lot of her songs for somebody with whom she can connect and with whom she will have a sense of belonging. And so, as I say in the book, we as listeners, when we hear those songs, we can almost fancy ourselves as the one that's missing from her life, as the other side of the equation for her. If we're in a certain sort of, if we're in the sort of vulnerable sort of state that I was in when I first heard it. And I think a lot of people at some point in their lives have that feeling of not sure, of not being sure of what's next, or where they belong or how they fit in. And so that's what I hear in Connie Converse's music. And I felt when I heard it, oh, this is where I belong. This is the connection I've been looking for. And holy cow, how is it possible that this music has existed for decades without anyone really knowing about it? Because it's so very, very good.
Well, now she's not the only one, of course. Many artists have taken this theme up. What is it about her taking this theme up that you find more compelling than any of the artists that followed?
That's true. It's not as though there aren't other artists that are. I mean, it's almost a trope of a certain kind of music of
Right.
talking about not belonging. Um, I think that there's a unique mix in Connie Converse's music of what I just talked about, but also a refusal to play a victim, and taking a responsibility for one's own life, and certain sometimes graveyard humor, but a certain humor, a wittiness that's mixed in there as well. Um, and I think the combination of all those elements of her lyrics, when you add them to her style as a performer and as a singer, and you think about the various ways in which her music is informed by music that came before it, but doesn't imitate any of it and does sound like it could be made today, all of these elements together make her an absolutely compelling figure to me.
That's really interesting. I want to also talk about her art songs too, because this is where
Great.
I got hooked. Like I
Yeah.
said, I enjoyed her songwriting, but it didn't catch me the way it caught you. Maybe I wasn't at the same wavelength. When I heard the art songs, this is where her musical intelligence reached me. And I said,
Mm.
oh, this is not just someone who was good at writing songs. This is someone with a musical Sondheim like mind, or I mean, these could be Ned Rorem songs. These were top notch art songs.
Yeah, right on. I'm so glad to hear you say that. And I hope that more people will say that as they hear them, because most people to date know Connie Converse for her guitar songs, what she called her guitar songs. And those art songs that you're talking about, written for a classical voice and piano, are a different beast altogether.
Yes. No, she wrote an opera or she was working on one, but that didn't survive so much. The art songs are all we have in this regard. She clearly got very interested in classical music and in music in general, wrote a 1,000 song survey of what makes songs work. Fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. And how she came to have the knowledge and um, the breadth of expertise to write in manuscript form these art songs, uh, um, almost all of which were left behind only in manuscript form. We don't have performances of them by her except for one song, "Vanity of Vanities."
Yeah.
It's a mystery to me. It's one I was never able to solve because she never went to music school, and my guess, my educated guess, having studied this woman in her life for all these years, is that she taught herself. She taught herself music theory, and she went on a self-directed study of of classical song.
Hmm. And
Yeah.
and she also taught herself, I assume, art. She was a cartoonist, and you said she was a painter. I know you are also a visual artist as well as a musician. What connects you to her art?
Oh, um, I mean, I just love it. I almost want to say I love everything that she did. Is that true? It might be true. Um, I I just connect with her expression as a human being,
Hmm.
and it comes through in whatever avenue she takes, whether it's art or music or writing or poetry or what have you.
Yeah. Well, what about the non-artistic writing, the more political science aspect of her? Are you also compelled by that?
I am compelled by it. Some of it, I feel that I could have taken years more before completing my book to do my own sort of independent study on some of the issues that she was tackling. Um, and as I say at the end of my book, I hope that other people will come in my wake and write their own critical analysis of that work, because I think that it deserves to be studied and appreciated on its own merits. Um, it's much denser, it's much more academic, it's not quite as, to me, easily accessible as her art, but I think it's definitely as significant a manifestation of her brilliant mind, for sure.
I definitely want people to read this book because I found it just a tremendously enjoyable read. It's long, but it doesn't feel long. It's a wonderfully detailed, interesting exploration of who she was and why she was and why she wasn't who she could have been. The one thing I do want to talk about a little, and it's not a secret, when she was 50 years old, I believe, she vanished. And we're not talking about just went on holiday. She vanished from all traces. Can you talk about that? Why did she do this?
Well, it wasn't the first time she'd done it in her life. It was just the last known time that she did it. Um, After her sophomore year at Mount Holyoke College, where she'd been given a free ride scholarship, she vanished. And for the next 9 months, I was unable to track down a trace of her anywhere,
Wow.
until she shows up in New York City in 1945, February 1945. Um, Later in early 1961, she told uh, friends and family that she was taking a sabbatical to Ann Arbor, and at the time she was living in New York City, and she never returned to New York City. And the whole thing seems to have been just a ruse. I don't think she ever intended to go back there. So she vanished from Manhattan and turned up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where she spent the last 14 known years of her life. And then in 1974, in August, uh, 1 week after her 50th birthday, she disappeared again and has never been seen again. Her body was never found. Her car was never found. She could be 98 years old today.
Yeah. That's fascinating. And you talk a little bit about possible attempts to find her, but really we have nothing. It's quite an interesting thing.
Yes, as far as I know, there were no attempts to find her. Um, the
You,
family did not report her missing. That's what I was told.
yeah.
They did not. hire a private detective to try to find her, although they apparently consulted with one. Um, there was a brother-in-law who I was told did try to track her down through a private detective, but the family didn't want to talk about that.
Hmm.
Um, so all I do really at the end of the book is, in terms of the disappearance, is just report all the various things that people told to me about the events surrounding that final disappearance. And then yeah, I think it's up to the reader to take it from there.
Now, this book is, while it is about Connie Converse, it does reflect strongly on you as well. It's a very personal book, even though it's a biography. And if you don't mind, I'd like to talk about your story. Is that all right?
Sure.
Okay.
As,
Um,
as long as it doesn't get, as long as it doesn't overshadow Connie Converse in any way.
well, I don't know. I think it's going to be a parallel story. I don't think it's any less important to Connie's story and why you chose to write about her. Can we just see where it goes?
Sure, by all means.
All right.
Yeah.
Now, you, like Connie, are interested in many things. You've written on a number of subjects. You're interested in visual art. You've been a songwriter, a performer. Uh, Probably musician is the strongest of your identities, at least that I was able to see. And you have an interesting history in that regard. Your dad was a very, very good concert violinist who could have been a professional, got a scholarship to Oberlin College, but chose not to do it. Instead, he decided to become a business person. And you write in the book that peace of mind eluded him, and that when he played for you, for those brief glowing moments, he seemed to be who he actually was, who he actually was. Can you talk a little bit about when did you see that in your father? Was it when you were young, or did you notice it when you were older?
Well, my dad rarely picked up the violin when, in my memory, I can think of a handful of times. And that is something I refer to at the very end of the book because of the parallel that I saw and that I felt while I was researching Connie Converse with her. Um, the sort of prevailing story about Connie Converse until now, which I hope my book helps to correct, was, oh, she stopped playing music and then she disappeared. Untrue. She stopped playing music, and then she had 14 more years of her life in which she did other things.
Right.
Um, but that passion of hers as a creative artist seems to have been squelched. Whether she squelched it herself or whether it was squelched by others, I don't know. But similar to my dad, there was a snuffing of a flame that had burned bright, and I couldn't help but see that parallel and to feel uh, a sense of connection to what my dad might have gone through and what might have made him at times a deeply troubled person, as I think Connie Converse was. So it was a way to try, in learning about Connie Converse and thinking about Connie Converse, I was also learning about my dad, uh, who died in 2015, but who I thought about a lot during the process of writing this book.
You risked having the passion squelched yourself. At an early age, you studied violin. You studied for 8 years, but you had to quit because you were subjected to the abuses of a very bad teacher, apparently.
No, you did your homework. Yes, that is true. I did study violin as a kid, and I did give it up because of a nasty teacher. Um, One, ironically enough, that I was sent to by my dad. Um, but it wasn't as though I went on to non-creative pursuits
No,
from
not
there.
at all. Right. Right.
Yeah, so that I guess would be the difference.
But you did decide not to ever take lessons again. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes, I never took another lesson.
Right. Of any kind.
Probably true, but definitely not a musical lesson. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, because you went on to play guitar. Your family, you wrote, was working class, but you were sent to an expensive college to be given a very good education. Is that In what way was that difficult for you?
Well, my the thing that my dad always instilled in me and in my brother was that there's nothing more important than knowledge and education. He always encouraged us to read books and to study hard and to be as um, knowledgeable about things as we could be. So, uh, for that reason, that was a top priority for him to send us to the best possible colleges that we could get into. And I owe him that. I'll always owe him for that. Uh, he sent me to Vassar College, um, and although I feel that what I learned in Vassar, the greatest lessons I learned at Vassar came outside of Vassar's classrooms. Um, the experience was still invaluable, and my education certainly continued and deepened there.
One assumes when you go to an expensive college that you are on a career track for something you can do when you graduate from an expensive college, a lawyer, doctor, business person. Was your dad okay with the path you chose, which was to, get very serious into being a street performer?
No, um, the shorter answer is no. I graduated from Vassar and I started a theater company in Poughkeepsie, New York, where Vassar is, because Poughkeepsie had no theater to speak of other than a house that traveling shows would come through. And I was producing and directing theater as an undergraduate and had a core group of people who wanted to continue doing that with me. So we tried to make a go of it and did it for a season, and discovered that Poughkeepsie was not that interested in the kinds of things that we wanted to do. So we folded up that tent, and I got on a train and I went to New Orleans to be a musician and to play on the street, as you say. Uh, and after doing that for a couple of years, um, I my dad caught me at a weak moment during a visit home, and he said, "Howard, I think you're floundering, and what is it you want to do with your life?" And at the time, I had my then girlfriend and I were talking about maybe moving to New York because we both had ideas to uh, continue our practice as theater artists. I wanted to come and direct plays. She wanted to come and be an actor. Neither of us could afford what it would cost to move to New York. So I was offered a job in Connecticut, um, a few towns over from where I lived, running my dad's laundromat dry cleaner, um, washing people's clothes and folding them up and putting them in bags and taking care of the dry cleaning when it came in. And the idea was that I would then save up the money I needed to move to New York by having this full time job. And so I did that. It cost me a couple of years and more than that in psychic time, um,
Yeah.
and psychic tolls. But that allowed me to go to New York, where I did start directing plays. And one of those plays was Elmer Rice, a revival of Elmer Rice's 1929 play Street Scene. And for that production, I brought in the little band that I had been playing with in the subway to play songs from the 20s. And we were discovered and offered a gig at the Algonquin Oak Room, which no longer exists, but back then was a significant cabaret room, supper club. Uh, and the New York Times came, and the New Yorker came, and all the papers wrote nice things about us, and I had a music career. And
Yes.
yeah,
Bit of a
that's
surprise. You were expected to fail at this. They threw you in there as a cover because they didn't have anyone,
that's
if I
correct.
got the story. And then you all succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations.
That's correct. Yes. Yes.
Congratulations. And that room is great. I think I had dinner there once. It's a really nice room. I'm sorry to hear it's gone.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.